First of all, I think this is a very original and clever event. Not been out like it at anything since. Congratulations to everyone who put it together, including CAJ's own Adrian Riley, who's hiding behind that flyer there. The only prop I have is this, slightly less impressive than the last few speakers, but this is the research we've just been working on Stop and Search and have just finished, and will see the light of day properly in the new year. Anyway, I will carry on holding it up as my notes are on the back of it, but also so you don't forget about it. Like most of our research, it should be a reminder that human rights actually have a practical purpose, and that they are there for good reason. And that there's a lot of learning that goes into them and their development. If you think about the issue of the state, like everyone else having to operate within the law, any definition of the rule of law is going to flounder if it doesn't just include domestic laws, which states, of course, can change, but also human rights standards. When the state tends to operate outside of human rights standards, there tend to be quite serious consequences, perhaps unintended consequences, perhaps intended. It's not only the impact on the person who's originally affected, but it's also, in the longer run, the issue around state institutions losing legitimacy, and also around the issue of how acting outside of the human rights framework can fuel conflict. Now, thinking of this building that we're in at the moment, there are plenty of examples. The obvious one is if you think back to all of the issues around ill treatment of detainees that took place outside of the human rights framework, outside of rules around torture and inhuman and degrading treatment that were there for many years, and the role that had in fueling conflict here. And if that hadn't have happened, and if it hadn't happened in other places, Kenya and Aden and other places before it, would it have happened if it had been stopped, if there wasn't the impunity at that stage? If it had been stopped, would it have reoccurred in other places such as Iraq? Are those sorts of lessons learned? We have turned to this topic in terms of Still Part of Life here, because it goes back to a report we did roughly around 20 years ago called Part of Life Here, which looked at the use of stop and search, looked at the issues of harassment. It was actually at that stage a survey of young people. This isn't as comprehensive as we haven't been able to do a big survey. And obviously stop and search isn't as serious as issues of ill treatment in terms of the intrusion it has. But in our experience, if it is used ineffectively, inappropriately, disproportionately, and arbitrarily, it can fuel conflict. That's not to say there's not a legitimate purpose for stop and search. Of course there is. When there is good reason to target an individual because there is good reason to think they might have prohibited items, stolen goods, weapons, whatever, on them, then that's the appropriate use of stop and search. When stop and search oversteps human rights compliance, it is when it is used either in an arbitrary way, it is used because of stereotyping in a discriminatory way against particular groups, or even when it is used effectively as a tool of harassment. What we find quite often, and this is the case, and to use the term, it's quite often used with suspect communities as a tactic, as a deterrent, not actually to genuinely search for items which are rarely turned up, but to deter unlawfulness by having the presence of the mass use of stop and search. That's there in a lot of places. It never tends to work. In our experience, it doesn't work. It is counterproductive. It tends to fuel conflict, and you can see why. And you can see why, particularly in the context here, where there have been communities with very antagonistic relationships with the police. If their main interface in the modern day is the rather unnecessary use of stop and search within the community, it is clearly not going to move things on in terms of creating a climate of legitimacy for policing. It's going to make policing more difficult. We speak about suspect communities in the same way we'd speak about any other group of people who faces prejudice. And when you get a group of people who faces prejudice, you tend to be in quite a risky place in human rights terms, because you can be in a place where the abuse of people's rights tends to be widely accepted. because that group isn't seen as deserving of the same rights as everyone else. If you think of an example, if you think of the issue of internment, that's not widely practiced in Europe anymore. You'd expect there'd be an outcry if police officers were given the powers to raid homes and workplaces and lock people up without trial, without charge for lengthy periods of time. But that does happen in Europe by immigration officers quite regularly. And if your first thought is that, oh, well, that's maybe different, I think you need to think again, is it really different? Do the same principles not apply? But that type of thing doesn't tend to make headlines. The abuse of migrant rights doesn't make headlines. There isn't the same outcry that there would be if non-migrant rights were being abused in the same way. On the other hand, on the flip side, migrant deviance does tend to make the headlines in a much greater and exaggerated way. One of the ones I've noticed recently, I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but must be perhaps, given all the issues facing society, it's one of the more minor ones, but the issue of sham marriages, which as far as deviance goes doesn't seem to be particularly deviant, seems to make our local headlines very easily. Now, why is that the case? Why is something seen as so deviant, if not that it's tapping into a stereotype against a group being deviant? And we find much the same with the way stop and search can be used. Stop and search tends to be targeted at working class communities in many places, including here and on both sides of the community. We found two other suspect communities within the research. One is the community of young people in general. The other is any community to which the label of dissident Republican can be attached. And again, human rights has a purpose. If there's any acceptance that human rights can be set aside for particular groups, then we end up in a dangerous place. What we've looked at is that there are usually safeguards on stop and search powers to stop them being used in either an arbitrary or in a discriminatory way. What those safeguards usually entail are things like ethnic monitoring. They entail things like having a code of practice to set parameters about how things can be used, that they can't be used as a sort of mass deterrent. They have to be used to genuinely search for items when there's good reason to think people might have them. And again, above all this, threshold of reasonable suspicion against an individual that the police officer must have. Now, we've powers that don't have a lot of those safeguards. Most people will be familiar with the fate of Section 44 of the Terrorism Act, which the European Court struck down as unlawful because it could and was used in an arbitrary way. People may know we have a very similar power on the statutes books here, Section 24 of the Justice and Security Act 2007. That's another emergency type stop and search power in terms of how it's constructed. There's no requirement for individual reasonable suspicion. There's no monitoring on community background. There's no code of practice. In theory, it's only supposed to be used for searching for weapons. In practice, it seems to be used for pretty much anything. That power was used 22,000 times in the last reporting year. It's used very frequently. That was actually a drop from the previous year. In terms of one measure of how effective or ineffective it is, less than 1% of those searches ever ended in any sort of arrest, and there's no detail about what the arrest was actually for, whether any of those arrests actually related to paramilitary activity or whether they related to other things, like, for example, resisting the stop and search, i.e. they wouldn't have existed. The stop and search hadn't taken place. And what we found in here is, yes, whilst there are circumstances that are intended to use these powers without reasonable suspicion against an individual, which tend to be when you have a genuine sort of threat or on the aftermath of an attack and you're trying to intercept perpetrators, that's not how these powers are generally being deployed. They are again being deployed as a deterrent against a suspect community. It looks as if, in part at least, the policy is to use the powers for multiple stops of people who the police think but don't have enough evidence to substantiate reasonable suspicion might be dissident Republicans. Now, It's very questionable about whether you can do this under the legislation. Because the legislation says you must just use this power when you're actually searching for items. It appears it's being used for quite different purposes, this sort of preemptive disruption. And again, in our experience, not only will that be ineffective and intrusive, it's also likely to fuel rather than deter any form of conflict. And there's a lot of déjà vu in terms of what we've turned out in this research, because they were pretty much the same points that were made 20 years ago. The same gaps in the legal framework, the same gaps in the policy framework, the same problems that allowed policies to be used arbitrarily then seem to still be present now. And of course, if police could turn around and say, look, we can justify this, it's entirely necessary that we use these powers, here is the evidence for it, then that would be one thing. That evidence base simply doesn't exist. There isn't an evidence base that it is necessary to use this. But there's plenty of evidence that its usage is fueling conflict and fueling problems. It might be invisible in many places, but it's not in others. And unless we're to repeat the issues that we thought we'd dealt and done and dusted 20 years ago, we're going to have to look very carefully at the use of this power. Thank you.